Hey guys, Average Woodsman here. So I figured I'd do a quick video on just some of the basics of survival knives. Now, this is not going to be the most in-depth. This is not going to be long, but I just brought a couple of, just a few of my knives from my personal collection out here just to kind of have a brief discussion. So, one of the things you need to remember when you're choosing a knife to carry with you out in the woods, just in case of an emergency, is that it needs to be large enough to take care of tasks that you may have to in an emergency situation. You know, just for example, maybe batoning. It needs to be robust enough to be able to do those tasks, but it also needs to be small enough where it's not large, cumbersome, and lacks the ability of being able to do some of the finer carving tasks that you're going to definitely need to do in an emergency situation, and then stuff you just want to do while you're out in the woods. Maybe you are around camp, maybe you are, you know, if you are in an emergency situation, you may have to do things with that knife that requires fine motor skills, and the blade, if you're carrying a huge chopper as your primary blade, it's your only blade, then you may not be able to do those things. So right off the bat, blade that is full tang and large enough to do a wide array of tasks. So for instance, a lot of people are, would say, oh, I just carry, a folding knife like this. For instance, this is a Buck 110. This is the Ultimate Hunter model. I carry a folding knife, or my pocket knife for today, the Access by Benchmade. They say, oh, I carry a folding knife. Well, that's all and good, but if that's your primary blade when you're going out into the wilderness, and if something happens, this is not a good option to rely on in an emergency. It's good to carry a pocket knife. I think that it's actually quite advantageous. It's smart to carry a pocket knife to have multiple cutting tools. But if you're only going to choose one cutting tool, this should not be it. So you're going to want something that's relatively large enough to be able to span a decent amount of wood in case, in an emergency, you need to span a larger piece of wood for batoning. So, like for instance, this Highlander H1 has a 5-inch blade, and it's also 3/16 of an inch thick, making it more than robust enough to do pretty much anything. So this is my SE4, just a good budget blade. You really can't go wrong with SE. One thing that I always do to any knife that doesn't come from the factory with a good 90-degree spine, I put it on all of my knives that I carry out in the woods with me. But this one just has the Knife Connection G10 handle scales, because a lot of the handle scales on the SE knives are extremely thin. But this is a good blade, an inexpensive blade that can be used. I tend to stay away from the stainless steels, the super steels. For the most part, this blade I didn't have, there's no option for like 01 or A2, 1095, like a lot of knives, but this one is actually in 3V, which I like 3V. I'm just not personally a big stainless steel guy. I'm not a big super steel guy. I have a lot of experience with super steels. I've owned a lot of super steels, especially in folding knives, but I'm just not a huge fan of them for my primary knife. I like a good carbon steel. It just tends to do a lot better. One last thing I want to point out, guys, before we go is you want your blade, whatever blade you choose, doesn't have to be a $500 custom knife, but whatever blade you choose, make sure that it's from a company that has a good reputation, and that it's made out of a quality steel that you can trust. So it doesn't have to be made out of a super steel, and it doesn't have to be made out of a stainless steel or anything like that. It can be made out of a carbon steel like 1095, 5160, 01, A2. A lot of the Bark River, a couple of the Bark, well, actually all the Bark Rivers that I currently own are all in A2 because A2 is one of my favorite steels. But just make sure that it's from a company that has a good reputation and that it's made out of a quality steel that has a good heat treat, because you can get the highest end knife, but if it doesn't have a good heat treat and the steel is not what you're specifically looking for, it's just not going to work for you. So just keep that in mind. I personally like 01 is really good. A2, I really like A2. 1095, I have a lot of experience with 1095, and you can really go with whatever steel you want, but just remember, just keep it within the limitations. So something like a carbon steel, a high carbon steel, is going to rust, but it has a lot of benefits in and of itself. You can use this to create sparks in an emergency, as long as the spine of the knife is hard enough and you have like a piece of flint or chirp. If you have something like a stainless steel, you're not going to be able to do that. A lot of people say that something like, I don't know, a 3V or another type of, some of the super steels, the edge retention is a lot longer. I personally, in my experience, I have not found that to be the case in the field. Now, I may say that, like people, in laboratory testing and on paper, but I can't personally tell the difference between something like 01 or A2 with a good heat treat and something like 3V. There's not such a substantial difference that I think it's justified to pay the extra for it, at least not in my opinion. That's just been my experience, and regardless of what anyone says, it's not necessarily harder to sharpen. It just takes a lot longer to sharpen, especially in the field. So if you're in the field and you don't have, all of your Japanese whetstones, or you don't have whatever type of sharpening device you use, your work sharp or whatever, if you don't have that with you in the field and you need to do something to this edge more than just stropping it with a light strop, if you do damage the edge or you do work it until it gets really dull, it does take substantially longer than pretty much all of the super steels and a lot of the stainless steels. Some stainless steels are pretty close, but most of the time the high carbon steels are going to do better in that situation. As long as you take care of a carbon steel, it's going to take care of you. As for the super steels, they're really good. They're durable. They hold an edge for a really long time. I just personally prefer a carbon steel for the vast majority of situations. If I was in, like back in Florida when I was doing a lot of camping around saltwater, it makes sense to have a stainless steel knife. It was a really high humidity and I was around a lot of salt water. Then it makes sense. But in most situations, I think a carbon steel is the best, especially for a survival type knife. A lot of people may argue that and say that that's not the case for them. That's just my opinion. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you guys for watching this video, and I will catch you on the next one.